Good afternoon. My name is Robin Citizen, and I'm the Senior Manager of Festival Programming here at TIFF. As you join us today, we encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, who the traditional keepers of the land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it's unceded territory. I'm located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful to work on this land. We're thrilled to present today's talk on critical narratives of nationhood as part of National Canadian Film Day. I would like to extend a thank you to our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oréal Paris, and Visa, as well as our major supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. We would also like to give a special thank you to our TIFF members and donors whose support helps us bring the power of film to life. National Canadian Film Day is an annual celebration of Canadian cinema organized by Real Canada, featuring free screenings and conversations about Canadian film, hosted by participating organizations across the country. Check out our selection of National Canadian Film Day titles on digital TIFF Bell Lightbox, available to rent for free today on April 21st, and then for a small cost over the next coming weeks. For more information, visit digital.tiff.net. As we celebrate National Canadian Film Day, we recognize that Canada is far from a monolithic society. Built on land that was taken from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, Canada is a fragile concept of a nation that has become a haven for immigrants all over the world, while also struggling to come to terms with its own longstanding history of institutionalized racism, discrimination, and inequity. We're honored to present a panel discussion with some of the most exciting filmmaking voices working in Canada, who leverage genre conventions to explore shape and challenge concepts related to Canadian nationhood. Corey Bowles is a multidisciplinary artist from Nova Scotia, Canada. His credits include Trailer Park Boys, the children's show The Mobleys, Studio Black, the dance production Juliet and Romeo, Little Dog, Digstown, and Pretty Hard Cases. His first feature, Black Cop, premiered at TIFF in 2017 and went on to earn Best Canadian Film at the Vancouver International Film Festival. The film won Best Narrative Feature at the St. Louis International Film Festival and the John Dunning Discovery Award at the Canadian Screen Awards, and was nominated for Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia Masterworks Arts Award. Thanks for joining us, Corey. Next, we have Danis Goulet. She's an award-winning writer and director. Her films have screened at festivals around the world, including TIFF, Sundance, Berlinale, and MoMA. She's a former programmer for TIFF and a former director of the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival. She's an alumna of the National Screen Institute and the TIFF Filmmaker Lab, and a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences. Her debut feature, Night Raiders, was developed with the support of the Sundance Institute and was selected for the Panorama section of the 2021 Berlinale. She's Cree Métis, originally from Northern Saskatchewan.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for joining us. And finally, Mina Shum has written and directed award-winning films that have premiered at Sundance, Toronto, and Berlin. Her features are Double Happiness from 1994, which won Best Canadian Feature at TIFF and an Audience Award at Torino. Drive, She Said, 1997. Long Life, Happiness, and Prosperity from 2002. Ninth Floor from 2015, and Meditation Park from 2017, which won TIFF Film Circuit's People's Choice Award and the CAAM Fest's Audience Award. Shum's other creative ventures include short films, essays, installations, and immersive theater. In 2020, Shum was awarded an honorary doctorate in fine arts from Simon Fraser University. Shum has a BA in theater studies and a diploma in film production from the University of British Columbia. She's participated in the Whistler Film Festival Screenwriters Lab, Cineworks Independent Film Co-op, and the Canadian Film Centre's Telefilm Canada Feature Comedy Exchange. Welcome, Mina Shum.
Hi.
So welcome, everybody. We're super pleased to connect for this really important conversation. And I have so many questions about your work and what it means to be Canadian on National Canadian Film Day. So I think we should probably start with defining our terms, right? So when we talk about Canadian cinema and national identity, what does this mean for you? And how did it shape your decisions to kind of become storytellers and filmmakers in the Canadian film industry?
All right, who's going to start with that one? I'm happy to go. I was like, you spoke first. Go. Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in Saskatchewan, and when I was growing up, I think the TV and film that I was digesting, of course, didn't represent me as a Cree Métis woman. However, I didn't really realize that I was missing anything. And I loved the idea of, shooting video, which I used to do, but I didn't realize that film could actually be a career. And I would say what brought me to film eventually, besides a natural inclination and love of it, was a scarcity and a lack of representation. So I don't think when I was growing up, I related to Canadian screen culture in any way. I'm trying to imagine, I guess CBC was the biggest, presence in terms of the Canadian public television, but I grew up in a small town in northern Saskatchewan, and it wasn't until I moved to the south in Regina that I started to have greater access to art house cinema through the Regina Public Library cinema. But I don't think I really grew up with an awareness of Canadian film or that I would at all have a place in it. And I eventually got a job on a film set and totally caught the bug, and then moved out here to Toronto. And I was working in casting when I first started in film. And so one time I was in a casting office, and I was casting, along with the people that I worked for, a US television pilot in which an Indigenous woman comes onto the screen, stands there silently in front of a waterfall, sacrifices herself, just jumps over the cliff. And that's the beginning of the pilot. And we had called in these amazing Indigenous actresses that I greatly admired. And I was watching them all one by one come into the room, say nothing, they're literally voiceless, and then die. And that was their contribution to this. And then I watched it on repeat, because everyone knows with auditions, you're seeing it over and over again. And it was a real moment for me. I just realized, first off, I'm the team that is supposedly on the side of putting this kind of garbage out into the world. This is what I work for. And also, it was like the penny dropped. It was like, we have to tell our own stories. And so I quit casting, took a filmmaking workshop, and then came into this amazing community through the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival. And then I started programming for the festival, and I came into film through Indigenous film first. And so I got to see everything from around the world that Indigenous filmmakers were making. And so I felt like I was situated in Indigenous film before, Canadian film in a sense. And then it's like, as you educate yourself, you grow wider into what the larger dominant nation of Canada's making, and then also what different worlds are making, different countries. And, film is normally categorized under a national cinema, whereas Indigenous film exists outside of those borders. But in terms of the way it develops, I think it can be very much grouped in a sense of having this global community that exists in a sense like a national cinema, except it's not defined in that way. And so I came into Canadian film, I would say, much later. And then in terms of how those things influence each other, I can't say that I know, except to say that I, have so much respect for what many different voices of people are doing in Canada. And I would definitely say that that's an influence on my work. Even being here with Corey and Mina and the amazing work that they've done. Yeah, it's an incredible community.
Well, I'll go next. I feel like I always wanted to be a storyteller from a very young age. I immigrated from Hong Kong when I was 9 months old. And my family, as many immigrant families have this experience of, they kind of got stuck in the period they left. So I was definitely raised by old school parents, old traditions, and we were the other in anywhere we lived, because we weren't the dominant culture. My parents didn't speak English very well. There was a class difference because of that. And but from a young age, I wanted to make movies, and yet not from a privileged place, not because my parents were storytellers, they were working class. And so I had to fight to kind of get my way into film school, fight to find what my voice was. Like, I think I remember writing a story in film school in creative writing where all the characters were suburban Caucasian people. And I was sort of writing a satire. And my teacher read the script and he said, well, what about the Chinese female drummer you have in this script? Why aren't you interested in exploring this? And I said, well, that's not what I see in the world, in media. What I see is suburban Caucasian people living their privileged life. I don't see my story. And he said, you got to tell it. And that's sort of, that happened at the same time that Adam McGoyan and Patricia Rozema were coming out with their first films. And I saw a movie called Family Viewing, Adam McGoyan's first feature, I think. And to me, it struck me as an immigrant story, because there was definitely the family inside it, and that they were at odds with society and trying to find their place. That became, to me, a beacon of light, that you could tell your perspective, that in Canada there was funding to actually get those stories told. So I really feel like I grew up in some ways where independent cinema in Canada was reaching a peak, or was just starting. Funding was starting to happen for filmmakers, and I had the hunger. And so it became this beautiful sort of synthesis. But I really do feel, it's funny, like in terms of the Canadian film community, I love all my people that that we know and we gather with, but I also feel like I'm part of a larger independent film scene. But also, I've been programmed in things where it's like the Chinese diaspora outside of the mainland. So I've had this sort of outsider view inside Canada. I think about the way I think, and because I have given myself permission to tell whatever stories I want to tell, it's certainly not, the perspectives are not the standard pitch. You know, 60-year Meditation Park, 60-year-old woman finds her independence accidentally. Like, that's not a pitch you would, a woman with no English and no job. So that's just like, that's not kind of what your standard pitch would be. But I think in a way that's kind of, I've figured out, I've given myself permission to be that. And once you do that, you can do anything. I can go back to writing about suburban Caucasian families if I wanted to.
Okay, yeah, these are both in a similar but not similar way, I guess. I grew up in Nova Scotia. You know, my family's Nova Scotian, and I was always a storyteller right through high school. My family has always been in storytelling, you know, from music to bluegrass. That's a whole other thing that happens down here in our community. And I sort of got through things through, I guess, I got into film late through the other disciplines I was working in. So I was working in music at a young age. So I had a record deal just out of high school, and then I was doing theater at the same time, and I was doing dance at the same time. And all of those things were having me travel. And there was, you know, contemporary dance especially has a very unique Canadian perspective. But as you know, that perspective was it was one type of perspective. You know, we were always sort of seen as fringe artists, or even in some ways in token artists. And when I got into dance, I was able to really dig and travel, that allowed me to travel worldwide and also do a little bit of more roots training and connect things to Nova Scotia more. And that was when I really started, I guess, discovering my voice as a Canadian was when I was traveling to other places and performing. And basically dance and theater and acting and TV and whatnot led me to creating film. It's just sort of everything from directing this thing to this thing basically manifested itself to where eventually this is where you land, where everything sort of comes to a head. And I found that even this, I think it's not that I didn't always want to do film, but I didn't realize I knew I wanted to do it until probably around 2005. And that was essentially the same type of thing, is like what stories are being told, not just about my community as a whole, as a national level, but what is really being told in my community in a regional level, which of course is very specific down here. But also, I guess I was always sort of not encouraged, I'd say I was always encouraged to also not criticize, but comment on what it is to be Canadian or what it is to be in my community in a different way, a very satirical way. And that sort of stuck with me. So I find that like, I love this country a great deal. I think I love I think obviously we have a lot of work to do with films and understanding what makes up our community. But I guess this is interesting. I think we're in an exciting time. I'm really excited, I guess, to be able to appreciate and have value to what our voice is here. Obviously when we're probably all coming up at the same time in film, people were trying to be something else. Like people were trying to be the stage, or people were trying to do what works across the border. And I was really fortunate to sort of come in a grassroots place where that wasn't important. We'd be hit with, an institution that'd tell you that, but we'd also be like, well, this is what's important to us. And I think that that's been really terrific and a really big value, I guess, in my outlook, in my outlook and who I am, I guess, as an artist in Canada, as an artist specifically from the East Coast, from Nova Scotia, which of course is very, very tight knit. All our little communities are very tight knit there, and we sort of always encourage each other to not be afraid of where you live, where you're from, what it looks like, and how is it any different. And that's that's been a big thing for me. I don't know if any of that made sense, but
it did. And you touched on it a little bit, and all of you make such different films. But Corey, you spoke about satire, and I just kind of want to follow up with, to what extent do you consider each of your films as part of a genre or a combination of genres? And I want to start with Dennis and Corey, because I have a particular follow-up for Mina. But Dennis, your recent film is, kind of set in the future and part of a speculative genre, and you work in satire, as you said. So what is it about genre that made it easier to tell that particular story?
Yeah, I think when I go to tell a story, I'm always thinking about what it is that I want to talk about. And generally, what I tend to want to talk about is the impacts of colonization on Indigenous people. And so when I first started making films, and I would say like even coming into film, as an Indigenous person, I think I always felt like an outsider, except landing at Imaginative as, a person coming from Saskatchewan, where moving to Toronto was like a kind of a big, daunting culture shock type of experience. Coming to Imaginative was like finding a home. And, you start to realize that when you see yourself on screen, like what a powerful thing it is. Like it was joyful when I began to discover that. It was joyful when I saw audiences watching Indigenous stories and being blown away, regardless of whether or not it was the experience of seeing yourself as an Indigenous person or non-Indigenous people. And so I feel like I'm always in this position of, so we had our community at Imaginative and it was amazing. And I also remember the impact of, I would say, this wave of Canadian filmmakers that you mentioned, Mina, and that you're very much a part of, that kind of came out of the 90s, and how much like there was a bunch of us, like blossoming film nerds that were just like, oh my God, there's this whole thing happening. But I don't think that I felt like there was a way for me to be a part of that. So coming and landing at Imaginative was so important. But when I started to look around me at the larger industry organizations, whether it's funding bodies or other festivals or that kind of thing, I realized that it was important for us to be recognized and to have a presence in those places and to be supported by those places. And so I started to think about, and I started eventually working for TIFF, and I started, advocating funding bodies as a part of our community. And it was always this sense of almost like infiltration, where it's like Indigenous film is my home and all these other spaces are spaces that I infiltrate somehow. It's like I find a sneaky way in and then convince everybody to let me stay there. And so the genre thing actually kind of felt the same, because there isn't a lot of Indigenous presence in genre films. And so I felt like I was infiltrating this genre, and it totally happened by accident. I was making dramatic films. I was really interested in social realism, like in my early work, in sort of like doc drama hybrid. And then I had an opportunity arose to be a part of a commission to celebrate the Winter Garden and Elgin Theatre's 100th anniversary. And of course, this is a beautiful old theater in downtown Toronto that TIFF actually screens at every year. And it's a stunning space. And I started thinking about the threads of past, present, and future. And also that in a young country, 100 years is a long time. But, from an Indigenous perspective, like my dad tells stories that reference the glacier, which is like thousands, going back. So it's amazing, so I started to think about how can we bring stories into spaces that go deeper into the history of this land, that goes beyond, even the container of the 150 plus years of Canada. And so I started thinking about these two characters, Wisagichak and Wetago, who come from the oral stories of Cree people, and I grew up hearing them around the fire. And to me, those were the classics of this land. But they're not widely regarded as the classics of this land. And so I wanted to explore them in that way. And then, of course, as soon as you have supernatural beings, which was really daunting for me to take on, like as a straight up drama filmmaker, like all of a sudden you have a shapeshifter and a cannibalistic being. And so tonally, I just felt like I was making a monster movie, and I didn't really know what to do with that, but I just treated it as an experiment, and then made this film about the two of them, which are characters from the past meeting up in a near future. And it was a dystopian Toronto, and we shot at Yonge and Dundas Square and then totally messed it up. And so it was like this, this huge, Canadian hotspot in downtown Toronto. And then bringing this kind of like, these characters that have been around for years, and then making it into like a dystopian genre movie. And so that's how I fell into genre. And then as soon as I was working in it, I found it completely liberating. There were things that I could say that I could almost say louder, and that you could hit heavier because, you weren't constrained by, like the rules of, just like straight up drama. And so it led right into Night Raiders, my feature. Like I just didn't stop. And I don't know if I'll stay necessarily in genre. I think I'll just go where my interests take me. But for me, it opened up a whole way of talking about the things that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that's I found that I seemed like I sort of fell into it because I trust nothing and I criticize everything, and that includes myself. And I've had to examine so much, and a lot of times when you're asked a lot of questions, especially there's a criticism that comes with telling stories where I really hone in on what's absurd about it. And a lot of times, instead of wanting to make something that is specifically referencing an experience I understand, or an experience we collectively understand, or we might question as a community, or anything like that, I just end up falling into a sort of, I wouldn't even say a full comedy, but it just, I'd say the absurdity of things. And a lot of times I find that the best way and the most enjoyable way to explore something that actually affects me. And it just, I guess it's sort of like, even with my short films, they were about something institutional. And of course, like, you know, I'm a very light-skinned Black Canadian. So even that in itself has, you know, that shaped me as an artist of how I fit into my own community, how I fit into another community, and where am I. So identity has always been a big part of my work, and identity and how, you know, how you move through the world that way has become a big part of my work. And a lot of times it's bananas. So those things, like in the case of a movie like Black Cop, like that I think was my most serious one to date, because I was also angry, but also in a lot of ways, you know, an audience has laughed quite a bit at some of those scenes, which were absurd when a cop was beating on the people for no reason. But at the same time, that's a horrifying experience in real life. But that ability to sort of see, I guess, to turn something on its head, or use excuses from the internet and say, okay, we're going to use that same excuse on you now. That sort of, you know, there's a bit of an impish way of approaching that, but it's also a way of having people examine something. Normally, a lot of times, the topics that I talk about in my films are topics I explore. Another group of people will see that through one lens only. So by giving them this other lens, they get to see a different perspective and can sort of share inside that perspective. And I've always sort of found like that. Even the movie I'm working on now, that's, you know, as much as it's somewhat a noir movie, it still talks a lot about rural gentrification and the disappearing of a Black family in a region that's been there forever. And the way, you know, I naturally fell into absurdity, which is, and I think that's, you know, in some ways that's also a very traditional way of telling stories, I suppose. And I fell into that, but that's, you know, and this, again, like Dan said, I'm not sure if I will always fall into that. It just seems to be where I always end up, because that seems to be the most natural way for me to tell a story. Yeah.
Right. And Mina, I would love for you to answer this question, but just to build on it for your particular work, you know, when it comes to family dynamics that are in your films, that's often kind of the content of melodramas, but I find your films tend to really resist kind of the over dramatization or the sensational aspects that melodrama really kind of immerses in. And I'd love for you to talk about, you know, that, but then also that you've also worked in other genres such as documentary. And so, yeah.
I do feel like it starts with the intention for me as a storyteller. What am I trying to do? Am I trying to ignite people? Am I trying to, I mean, often I will say one of the common threads in all my work is to empower people in the audience, for them to feel that one of my heroes is as flawed and as doubtful and as insecure as the rest of us, but that they can triumph. They can triumph over themselves and society and all the restrictions that society places on them. Often the biggest obstacles for my characters are not only perceptions of who they should be from the outside, but also encoding that inside their own behavior and how they have to break out of that. And so when I think about, like, one of the things I'm very careful of when I represent, and certainly in my first film, Double Happiness, because I came out of film school needing to make some money to make my movies. And so I got myself an acting agent because I heard that there wasn't enough Asian people in the casting pool. And I started going out for these auditions, Danny. So I sort of followed the story of what you were saying, in that I went to these auditions. agent was amazing. She was like, I'm gonna colorblind cast you. You're gonna go out for all these auditions. And I would sit in rooms with 6'2" blonde models, and I'm 5'3", okay? And I'd sit there and I'd wait for my turn, and I'd go in, and the entire scene was, we are in a Petro-Canada ad, and your car has accidentally gone through the car wash. So you're just getting your hair all done, and can you just act that? And I did this scene, and I realized we were voiceless. Like, representing me is not gonna help, right? Like, I'm just the Asian person number 5 in that scene with all the beautiful blonde women. It felt really odd and uncomfortable for me. And so when I wrote Double Happiness, one of the important things for me was each character gets to address the camera directly and go, this is who I am. This is how I feel. This is the story you don't see, almost in a confessional booth kind of way. So doing that, I wanted to make sure that none of the most of my characters, I try to take the preciousness out of it, because there is a stereotype with Asian characters that we're also like the good immigrant, the hardworking, humorless, taciturn, and so it's really important to sort of set up the expectations and then turn it on its head. And I think even like when I did Ninth Floor, which is a documentary, I'd come out of, my first film was a documentary called Me, Mom, and Mona, where we examined my family and the lies that we told in my family in order to circumvent my father's expectations. And so I came back after doing three features. I came back to documentary. To partly to not be defined, that I could do whatever genre I wanted to do. If there was a monster space movie in me, I should have, if I wanted to do it, I can do it. And also because taking on Ninth Floor, it scared the poop out of me, really, like to do that and to honor all the people that were in that film. It was really important that I got it right. And it's funny because I will say some documentary filmmakers don't feel that's a documentary, which is okay too. Like it's fine, but it's always like people are always, it's the fight or flight thing in our inherent animal nature, which is we're always trying to label people from the beginning. Are you friend or foe? Are you a genre filmmaker? Are you a documentary filmmaker? We're always trying to categorize because being in the nothingness is really hard. It's hard for us to figure out where we are if we're just going to not define people. So I'm constantly trying to break that open because I don't want to be penned in. I've spent my whole life being penned in. So growing up, and I won't do that anymore.
So for those of the people that are watching who may be emerging creators themselves, I was wondering if you could share some of your experiences as filmmakers working within the Canadian film industry, like what you've gone through to make your recent films, and then where you found support, like institutional support or personal support, as well as any barriers to accessing the means of cultural production or distribution and exhibition of your films.
Yeah, so
Dan, oh, sorry.
I was just going to jump in. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, so my first feature was funded by Telefilm, and it was also an international co-production with New Zealand. And that came about just because I think, again, the global Indigenous community is so interconnected that we had so many connections to New Zealand that it almost made that part of it not as difficult as one might think, but it did mean a lot of like work on behalf of the producers to make the kind of national agencies align in order to make this happen, which was incredible, and they did. Mm-hmm. So, you know, my film was funded through all of the regular avenues that a Canadian film is. And my film was, and I don't know if it's still the case, but I believe at the time that it was made, it was the largest budget that an Indigenous feature with an Indigenous person at the helm had gotten. And just before, the year before, the largest budget had up to that point been Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum. And so, you know, we were two films coming on to the scene where, you know, the genre kind of required, you know, like a certain scale. And we hadn't seen, you know, our stories funded at this level. So it was a huge, you know, victory and an amazing moment, you know, to get so much support out of our national and provincial funding agencies. But, you know, I do have to say that happened because of the years of advocacy on behalf of so many people, decades of advocacy, in fact, you know, to get support for Indigenous storytelling. And when I first came into Imaginative in the early 2000s, there was such a lack of visibility. You know, Imaginative had this mandate to support the writers, directors, and producers of the work. So in other words, we were saying Indigenous film is not defined by content, it is defined by the people behind it, the creatives, the key creatives. And it probably was another 10 years before that that conversation was even happening widely, you know? So we were just sort of doing our thing, and there was sort of a lack of visibility all around. So sometimes when you went in to a funding agency, you know, you would just be met with this sense of like feeling like you didn't exist. I was also a part of authoring a report on Indigenous feature film production in Canada, and I spoke to Indigenous producers and directors from all across the country that had like heartbreaking stories about what they had experienced in the industry, you know, whether it was microaggressions to full-on racism. And, you know, we realized that it was so important to advocate for more inclusion. And I think, yeah, it was, and for myself personally, you know, I've been told everything on certain productions from, we think your film is better without the inclusion of the Cree language. We want to hear the entire thing in English, to, you know, getting notes on a film from a broadcaster's reader that said that, for example, the allegory of residential schools that I was writing about was no longer relevant because priests don't hit or beat up kids. And as a country, we've moved on from that. And that note came to me at a lovely time when it was the very month that the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was releasing its findings on the impact of residential schools in the country at that exact moment that I was getting notes to say that the story I was telling was irrelevant because we'd moved on from it. So, you know, and those are just two examples of some of the things that you face as you're, you know, trying to pitch your stories, to say why your stories matter. Yeah, and so I think what that leads to often with our community, you know, when we, you know, go to work with major funders or big institutions, like there's naturally a lack of trust that we are wanted there. And so that's why I always say to these institutions and to the funding bodies who gave me, you know, so much support to make Night Raiders, and that was so important, and I'm so grateful for it. But their ongoing support and their ongoing signal to our community is that we are important to them. You know, we're just at the beginning of it, and I think this is an exciting time, but that signal needs to keep coming.
Yeah, it's really good. There's a lot of similar stuff. I had a really, again, an interesting experience because it's from Nova Scotia. So I'm one of very few filmmakers of color down here, and you know, extremely few Black. Oddly enough, we're all working together right now, so we're in the office. But one of the I guess one of the big things that, so I like I said, I had done a lot of different types of work, and when I was, even though I was acting in television for years, probably over a decade at a time, there were still a lot of people who said, "Oh, you can't make a film yet, or you can't do this yet." At the same time, I was seeing a lot of people who were many years my junior in experience or time getting opportunities and being thrust into something that I was like, I'm absolutely ready to be thrust into something. So, you know, I ended up doing a small film program, and that film program ended up allowing me to create a short film, which then I was told I wouldn't be able to do this because it was too it wouldn't translate as a film. So then I just kind of left that, and I got grants. I got a Canada Council grant for my first film, and then my second film following that, I got provincial grants and whatnot. And then I got another grant for another film. And a lot of that was just basically, tapping into the resources of who was around me, who were my friends, who knew me, who would trust me. And I was constantly just doing things on my own. When it was time for me to do a feature, normally what would happen was nobody would really be interested in my ideas. At the time, they were considered radical, or what someone actually said to me, racial genre. We were talking like maybe 2010, 2011. So what would happen is normally I get brought into something, and I really appreciate those. I appreciated the attempt to help or launch me, but usually it was to create something that was from them instead of trusting something that was from me. So I really still had a hard time kind of, I was really navigating through what I call insincerity and mistrust, and the insincerity being like, we want you here, but really at the time, even then, you could get what I would call token money. And then there was a couple things where you could trigger a little, is that here? Sorry, you could trigger a little bit of money if you've got, at the time, what we would call it a little bit of a diverse fund, or you could sort of pad an envelope. And really it was an attempt you were getting nowhere with it. There was no point in doing it because you weren't going to make that feature. So I ended up just going to the Canadian Film Center and really just at a mature age to sort of get where I needed to be. And luckily, when I started working into television, I was a big part of the show that came back. That was Trailer Park Boys, where I just really said, hey, and because we were friends, they trusted me. But it took me a long time. And even now at home, even though I work in a show at home, I was only hired once in Nova Scotia, besides the show, for a show that I wasn't directly involved in. And it was still difficult for me to be like, well, we need you to have more experience, or we need you to have this, or we need you, if you're going to make this, it's going to be too much. So, and for my film, I did Talent to Watch, which was great because I had my freedom to do that. And it's hard, no matter what, and people will not believe this, but it's true. No matter what, it's different for us. It's different for all of us. We have to work harder. We have to prove ourselves more. A lot of times the reason when we break through, the reason why we're mature is we have to spend years and years and years and years honing our craft in order to prove that we are as good as a person who's going to get a job on day one when they walk on set, or next year. They're like, this is my first time on set. I'm going to direct next year, and they'll get the job. And it's not even a thing where you go, okay, I'm bitter about this. It's just you have to work really hard and convince people so that you can. So I find that although things are changing, I would say, and things are probably different for us coming up at different years. But one of the things to look out for now is things can be confusing because everybody is scrambling to make things right really quickly, but they're still having a hard time relinquishing control. And that's where I say the mistrust comes from, because a lot of times people still won't trust you to be able to create or be able to helm something without some sort of watchful eye, or without them making sure you do it, which means they're really not willing to let go. So that's a hard thing, I think, to navigate, and it's something to watch for. And you have to just really trust yourself. And there are avenues out there that you can get things. And even the ways that we got our money through grants and whatnot, even they're reshaping now to be more inclusive and more open to Indians. But I really had to work like really, really hard in order to convince, to trigger that money. I'm really thankful for it because now I'm able to do more things for other people. But yeah, so it's an inherent mistrust. It's a sort of unseen natural opposition.
I just to add to what you're saying, Corey, I feel like a large part of the battle is to create my own opportunities, because I can't really control how other people see me or what I should be doing or what I'm capable of. All I can do is prove it in the work. And that means I have to be free, creatively in my heart. And that I get angry for, I mean, there have been so many like now, I love that we have the word microaggressions now, because when I was growing up, I just didn't know what that was. Sometimes it was not even micro, they were just aggressive. On my first feature, I was handed, after doing many shorts and winning honorary, I won a special mention at TIFF for Me, Mom, and Mona. I got my funding for Double Happiness. And for some reason, the producers, because of the funders, decided that I needed a white male, 50, 60-year-old guy to talk to see if, to make sure that I knew how to direct a movie, right? And what was so great about this director, Mort Ranson, is he sat with me for 20 minutes and then he just said, you know what you're doing, I'm leaving. He actually gave up his seat in a way. So I think it's staying the course. It's keeping yourself free. It's creating opportunities, because it's so easy for us to be misshapen, to try to fit into a mold. So I kind of try to tap into what would I do if I could do it? Anything, as opposed to what are they allowing me to do? And the other thing I wanted to touch on was this idea of community, you know, our community, my community, your community, your community. What I'm trying to do is that yes, I'm going to speak to that, my own community, but I also want to say that we have so much in common with all communities. So that I've heard this microaggression, Mina, that's really great, your new film. I think your community will embrace it. And I'm being said this by someone who's not Chinese, and it's a microaggression in terms of they're just sort of putting down my work in terms of its accessibility, right? And I'll listen to that and I'll be like, but I'm trying to make superheroes of all colors. I'm not, and all ages. I don't want to be defined. I don't want that person to be defined by your narrow scope of what my community is. My community is also the punk rock community in Vancouver, full of freaks, you know, and jazz heads, right? It isn't necessarily I'm just Chinese because this is what I look like. So I think infiltration is a really good word, because you are infiltrating. I show up to these parties that I'm invited to. I didn't want to go out. I don't want to go to your cocktail party, but I will go to be there and to change the shape and the color of this place. So for, you know, you started, Robin was saying, like, for the younger filmmakers, just show up, do your work. Yeah, we have to work harder. I totally love that you said that, Corey, because it's so true. We just have to work harder. I've actually sat with funders where they go, why can't you go and get someone else to give you some money? And I will look at them and go, I didn't get to go pee in the bathroom with the person with the money. I didn't get to go and be at that party because I'm not invited. So I think it's really great. Like I noticed in British Columbia, where I am, our Creative BC, which is one of our funding bodies here, has decided to remove the obstacle of having someone else vouch for you. That for BIPOC filmmakers, we often weren't invited to that party to get to schmooze, to know that person. So they're just removing that as an obstacle. And I feel like from a challenging policy perspective, we're seeing that a lot more. And it's going to mean like some films are going to be great and some films are not going to be not so great, but that's the real world too. I don't feel like we should be victim just because we're visible to different criticisms.
I think if I could jump in again, I think one of the nice things about what you're saying when you're talking about working hard and, you know, making, like, we take so long and we put everything, because we have to do that, we put everything in our bodies and our souls into these stories and into the work that we do. And what happens is they become, you know, they become really good. Like we get good things and suddenly that becomes, and it's really lovely thing to see, you know, to see Dennis's film get where he has to see Mina's film get where, and these become a standard, and all of a sudden we're, you know, it's looking a little different up there, and it's feeling a little different. it sounds a little different, and that's always really nice. So I think that there's always a bonus on that. Although it is hard, you manage to be able to, you manage to be able to more times than none prove, not even prove yourself, just prove that the voices or what you're representing deserves to be there, and it's nice that it ends up getting embraced. It gets embraced quite well for us, and that's a very hopeful thing. Ultimately, that's what, it'd be like, that's really nice cherry on top.
We're nearing the end of our time. That was the perfect way to wrap up the conversation. Thank you, Corey. And in some ways, I feel like we're just getting to the meat of this conversation. I have so many more questions, but I just want to thank all of you for being here today, Dennis, Corey, and Mina, for such a great conversation. I think it's going to be so helpful to people that are watching and want to be storytellers themselves, but then also people that are just fans of your work already. Thanks to the audience for your continued support and engagement at TIFF, and check out our collection of National Canadian Film Day titles here on the digital TIFF Bell Lightbox, available to rent for free today, April 21st, and then available for purchase over the next coming weeks. For more information, visit digital.tiff.net. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.